Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Should They Have the Power? And as we are witnessing, uh, as we're witnessing massive power grabs everywhere, I figured I would do something way different this week and give you an insider look from a fellow Stony Brook graduate at some of the places in the world where questions of power have very much been, let's just say, settled. Um, so, our traveler today will remain nameless, primarily because they are actively going to these parts of the world. Um, but he does have a lot of knowledge to share, and well, I I don't have the wealth of experience like Turkmenistan, North Korea, all these other places. So I figured I'm going to bring him in and I will talk a little bit about my own experiences in Russia. So first of all, sir, why don't you introduce yourself to the extent that you feel comfortable?
I'm a former Stony Brook student. I graduated in 2014, and my travels towards, I've always been something of a traveler. I was on my first plane ride as an infant over the ocean. Was doing that several years, and at some point, I got interested in visiting some of the lesser visited parts of the world, or some of the ones that are more where people feel the need to tread with a bit more caution. And so that started out with Stony with not Stony Brook. Sorry, Stony Brook is not that kind of
Ah,
society.
there you've seen some of the older dorms.
As much as some of the prior university presidents may have wished it to be such a society, it never quite got there. Um, but starting with Turkmenistan, about 15 years ago, eventually uh, doing a study abroad in Cuba via the SUNY system on a program that I believe unfortunately did not survive the pandemic, although it's short term, though the short term equivalent does still exist. And so I will plug it. It's SUNY Oswego. Great program, great people working there. Really good opportunity to visit a place that you know a lot of Americans hear about but don't really get to interact with in sort of with on their own terms. And then in my private life, ended up traveling in my not later on to North Korea, um, to Russia just before the pandemic, to Iran during the 2016 election, and more recently, I've been making a lot of trips to a place that doesn't really belong in this category in the same way, in my opinion, but that I've noticed that a lot of American travelers are nonetheless hesitant about, and for which travel really has dropped off lately. China, and I've been making repeated trips to there, partly because I needed a Chinese visa for the North Korea trip, and then at some point I liked the country so much I kept going back and back.
Well, I will say that yeah, other than during the pandemic when uh, COVID was there and not here, China has quite a bit in terms of public transit that I envy. It has, it's not a state like Russia or Iran where they're looking to snatch Americans off the street. It's not at all like that. It's
I
a
wouldn't say
much
Iran is like that either. Russia, it's harder to say post everything. Um, but Iran, the thing I will say as a queer person, Russia was the place that scared me the most. And it wasn't because of laws per se. It was because in Iran, your threat model is known. It's you are primarily dealing with hostile officials. but who nonetheless hostile officials who generally believe in the rule of law. As long as you don't, and officials are predictable. As long as you don't upset them, they're probably not going to do anything. In Russia, and I think this has changed a fair bit, but at the time pre-COVID, pre-invasion, the main threat as a LGBTQ traveler was from random people. And that is something, and I feel like this is something we're feeling a lot in the US. That's something you really cannot predict. And random people may not believe in the rule of law. They may not believe in the international order. And in fact, there's currently a lot of evidence that a lot of random people do not, in fact, believe in it.
Oh, I would say roughly 48% of American voters do not
It's
believe.
really funny how the I think it was is it 47 or 48% the number that keeps popping up in so many random places with Mitt Romney's quote in 2012, Trump's floor, like that 47% number really just keeps popping up in weird ways.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring you on specifically because uh, I feel like a lot of Americans haven't been to places where the rule of law has collapsed. And I wanted to ask you, other than the threats from random people in Russia, um, how have you experienced how have you experienced societies where speaking out is a total no-go? Have you seen people comfortable living their lives in most regards?
Well, yes, in general, I would say like the first thing I think that I have always said about like any of these places and this, also, and this also includes, a lot of places that I haven't been to that are in the news is, like um including like and I'm going to put a little disclaimer here that this includes um some other places that almost all the places that are off villainized, but in the press, whether it be right or left, is that people live there and people have complicated views and lives and stuff, and the government is but one aspect of it. The truly totalitarian society is honestly very rare to almost extinct these days. Maybe North Korea is the one outlier, although I will say in the Kim Jong-un era, even they have pulled back a little bit. It's noticeable. Um, that said, it is a big spectrum. In Iran, contrary to what you might hear about, what people are always saying, like people vote in Iran. Like there's elections with candidates with meaningful differences. Um, where dissent becomes more of a problem is, first of all, the government does often pick who is allowed to run, and depending on what the current mood is, they will sometimes curtail options more severely than other times. And also, they really don't tolerate protest, which I think is something we saw in the last year or so. And but that doesn't mean that
Yeah,
people are free to have
for
opinion.
for uh for context, what happened in Iran was protests against violence against women spiraled out into a lot more government violence and quite a few death sentences
Yes.
imposed on young women. Go on.
And they don't tolerate anything like that. But, that doesn't mean that people don't have opinions on affairs, and it doesn't mean that people don't feel, you know, free to have, you know, a day-to-day life that may or may not be less, may or may not be fairly religious. Some people are, some people aren't, and while the government leadership does take a very overtly religious hoover, that doesn't mean it's penetrating quite as much into people's lives. But again, some people are very religious, some people are not. They just all followed by the edicts put down. Although in Iran too, you do see a fair bit of rebelliousness against that, particularly. And again, I haven't, this was in 2016, so well before any of the recent events. Like a lot of women will, women are legally required to cover their hair in Iran, but a lot of women really work to skate by on technicalities on that one.
And I
And
mean,
that's the little protest, and that's a known thing.
so so protests exist in some shape or form in most
Yeah.
of these societies, but you may have to know what you're looking for.
Yeah. North Korea, not so much. You know, there it was when I talked to my guide, it was interesting. It was, if you asked him about the whole personality cult thing, which is, I would say, really a thing in North Korea, and you don't see as much elsewhere anymore. Well, Turkmenistan, a few other places, he was very upfront that was like, this is our religion. And that I felt was a level of frankness that I'm not sure was common. And there I think you don't really see as much about it. But um
How would you compare the North Korean quote unquote religion to what you see from not every Republican, but you know the type I'm talking about today. And their enthusiasm.
they're not there yet.
What would their look like?
I mean, we're not having statues of Trump yet, but like we're already hearing about renaming an airport after him, and he isn't even dead yet. Hell, he's not even not president.
So so starting to get into the realm.
That's certainly a breaking of norms that I'm saying, I don't, where I would start to worry is right now we're in this like the government becomes personalized, and that's very common, you know. But that's different from a cult of personality.
Okay. So what what are some attributes of places where the government is more personalized?
I mean, that's very common. That's what we're seeing right now with like, the lawyers are now supposed to be Trump's lawyers instead of the government's lawyers. There's no separation between the government and the person. And that's very common even in not totalitarian society. Like your average two-bit authoritarian does that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Speaking
and I
as
think that's
someone with
actually
a
very
lot of family in Hungary,
yeah.
I somewhat understand what the other side looks like.
And I think that's very different a bit than you see in like places like Cuba or places like, Iran. Well, Iran especially, like, they love to have pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, but day to day the government is actually really designed in Iran to be a whole group of people rather and a bureaucracy rather than a and Cuba is the same way, even if there is like a single person at the head, and like and China, really you see that like a lot of the government, even today, still takes a lot of traditions from Imperial China,
Yeah,
and it's
I think
yeah.
if we talked about attitudes towards civil service, uh, China today may compare favorably to the United States at the moment. Uh,
Yeah.
so you talked about being a little afraid in Russia. Is is there a part of your experience that comes from being a visitor, an American, someone with a a visa from a much more powerful country far away that made it so that you may be less afraid than some of the people you're interacting with.
Yes, I think that's always true, Um, well, it is the case, and I will remind everyone of this. You know, um, whenever you travel to a foreign country, you are subject to their laws. Uh, you know, there is still a certain amount of there's always, I think, the question of, when there's a broader context like this, is anyone are, you know, is anyone going to waste political capital on going after you? This is not me saying you should go to Russia and start um putting up the Putin signs and rainbow flags. For one thing, I don't think they have that much capital to lose, but in this current time. Um, but but in a place like, in much of the rest of the world, places that are not in a good relationship with your home country aren't necessarily going to spend their capital for small time stuff. It's always good to know what are the big no-nos. When I went to Iran, it was very notable that, like, amongst all of the other, like, hey, here's, yeah, because if you're an American going to Iran, um, there's a big, you have to go through a tour, and so they send you a little packet with, the usual packet that you get with these things with all the information. But one of the things that was called out specifically was absolutely no Salman Rushdie novels. Um, that was called out specifically. you know, you need to know what the big things are, and those are pretty. On the other hand, like, I did this with my family, and we did it as a private tour, so I got to set the itinerary, and I may or may not have set the itinerary so that we would drive right past the Natanz facility. That's for anyone who doesn't know. Natanz is the place where they are widely believed to be enriching uranium. Uh, and it is trivially easy to arrange your tour to go right past it. Uh,
So you would basically tell the average American considering going to these places that it's probably safer than they would imagine.
yes,
Um,
I would caution. I would all. I would always caution, like, hey, watch the news, watch the current events. For a whole bunch of reasons, I'd be worried about Russia now in a way I was not in 2018.
so are there certain ways of getting into these countries that to do it in a manner where your presence is safe there? Are there steps you have to go
I
through?
mean, just don't violate the rules is really what it comes down to, and maybe be careful if it's a place where the rules are not known.
All right.
You
I guess what I was talking about is um, an American can't just fly to Russia, correct?
Not anymore. Used to. Used to be able to.
How how is it that you're able to apply to get into all these places?
I mean, it's most of them have processes. They have rules, they have processes that if you follow them. The thing is, pretty much, every country exists within the international order of rules, and again, it comes down to the, like, capital and all of that. Like, not literal money capital, but political capital. You know, they all live in this international rules based order, and they generally like to follow it because they want their when it benefits them, they want it to they want the rules based order to be followed. So, all of these places have procedures by which, in Cuba, you just show up and they'll let you in. They even won't stamp your passport because embargo. They stamp mine, but that's because I have a student visa. Um, Iran, you apply for a visa. There are rules for Americans that are not the same as for, well, also Canadians Also British people and for some reason Canadians. These rules also apply to them. I don't know what's up with Canada and why they get special treatment. Uh, I understand the UK. But you do it and there's a way. The other side of this is even in the cases of countries that have no diplomatic relations with each other, such as the US and Iran, um, at the end of the day, the countries still need to talk to each other. And so there's always some designated alternative. In the case of Iran, it's the Pakistani embassy, actually. And
Hmm.
so there are Iranian diplomats who work within the Pakistani embassy who are the Iran interest section. Uh, Famously, for a long time, the U.S. special interest section in Havana was like bigger than any of the actual embassies, except now it's an actual embassy. So.
You you've seen a lot of these countries. Can you tell me a few of the things you've seen that uh, struck you as the most positive? The moments where you've gone, okay, wow, these people are leading full, happy lives.
I mean, really, it's just, you go into any, any of these, any place and you go and you go to a restaurant and see like, what's going on, People will tell you Cuba doesn't have restaurants. They do. A lot of it is people cooking out of their own homes. You know, and they have these little like set meals and stuff, and you'll see a whole bunch of Cubans queue up to, you know, because it's for them it's often a special treat because it's fairly expensive, um, compared to the ration system. But you'll see them, you talk to them, they'll tell you like which is their favorite, which one makes a really good fried pork sandwich, where's the best, which place has the best fricassee. Um, etc. That happens again in Iran. Like in Iran, even though you have a mandatory guided tour, you are left alone in the evening by the rules, and so you can go wherever you want and talk to people. Um, so that's one thing is like going to a restaurant or an eatery in their various forms, some of which we might not call a restaurant in the U.S. And just seeing people there, like enjoying the food and that seeing that there's a restaurant scene in some sense or other in all of these places. The other side thing is people will often be very very positive. Even with all the government relations stuff, people are often very positive towards foreigners on a personal level, especially in Iran. That famously they're very very they really like Americans. Like they'll be thrilled to tell you about the time they lived in the US or their American relatives, and you will talk to people and they'll just randomly clock you as an English speaker and start talking to you. Iran is probably the most notable of that because I wouldn't say there's a super high degree of English fluency, but it's there. Um, in a place like, you know, Russia, there's just a lot less English fluency, so you don't really have those conversations that much. But still, people are happy that you are visiting their country and and are willing to look at things beyond just the way the news reports things. And this is pretty much universal.
Um, what are some of the things that uh these basic strangers will say to you other than restaurant recommendations?
It depends a bit where, you know, um, in Iran, like I said, especially people will, clock you as American and go talk about their American relatives. I want to know where you're from. Uh, you know, that's a big one. Um, Oftentimes they're just, they'll just want to know like how's life different because things do differ a bit country to country. But generally the tenor is quite friendly. Even if ironically, you're in Iran chatting with someone about, how he loves the city of Arlington, Virginia, right underneath a Death to America billboard.
So
Although I will say those are
some
less
of
common
this
than you might expect.
hostility may be more in the government than in ordinary people, at least
What?
North America.
What?
Some of the hostility towards
Yes.
America abroad is much
It
more in government than in ordinary people.
it often is. And even so, and even then when it is more with ordinary people, the people this is something I feel like we have not done a great job of as Americans is, we tend to view the North Koreans as say the North Koreans as a monolith. And I think that's like very disrespectful to the North Koreans, who are people with individual lives and, you know, individual goals and successes and all of that. They're not, it's not just some, mindless like robot society's propaganda portrays them. Like people abroad I have found do a much better job of distinguishing individual Americans from their government than I found we do as a society here.
Interesting. I wonder if that's because it's just so much more common to see Americans depicted in media or American personalities on a
That's
world.
probably part of it. Like, and I will say this, I'm just going to be upfront here. This is something that is when I'm talking about the way Americans perceive the foreigners, this is regardless of your political affiliation. Like the way, you know, you know, obviously I think the way that the right talks about a lot of people in a lot of foreign countries is pretty obvious, but like the way some mainstream liberals talk about Russians is also not good.
Yeah, I would say it is incredibly varied
Yeah.
how at least Hungarians respond to me. Okay, I'm there to visit my trans cousin. Sometimes that's the end of the relationship. Sometimes that's, oh, wow, you're brave. Like saying that out loud, and there's a certain admiration. So it really, uh, it really does depend on people.
Yeah.
Um, there, there's usually, at least in these countries that have some semblance of an electoral process, there are enough people that fit the stereotype for the stereotype to have taken hold, for the government to have taken hold. But it is absolutely not a monolith. I really do enjoy going around with my cousin and watching him peel off fascist type stickers on whatever in the public areas and putting up uh, left wing LGBTQ plus type stickers right back where the fascist stickers were. And it's an endless,
It's just like here.
it's just like, it's just like here. Maybe, maybe a little more control over the media and government, but it is definitely just like here in that people there's just such a wide spectrum of
Yeah,
people that exist.
exactly.
Um, Hey, to bring it to this point, what are some of the things you've seen that have made you, ugh, you know?
I mean, some of the more visible reminders is like, in Iran, driving past the highway, the highways, and there are highway checkpoints. And, interestingly, they're very much you'll go right, they'll see you're a bunch of tourists, and they will have zero interest in you. Um, but it would be very different, potentially for citizens, and in Iran specifically, it's very different for someone who's from Afghanistan, which there are a fair number of in Iran. You know that the treatment would be very different.
So they, generally speaking, as Americans, you don't get the opportunity to see
Yeah.
uh
Not just as foreigners, as people who are foreigners from countries that are even countries that the government doesn't like, but that are more powerful. And I
so
know that in particular might strike some parallels with some current. stuff, that's one thing, you know, that you see that isn't like, you know, so good. You see like another thing you see in a lot of places is like there is a lot more visible pre presence. A lot more. Um and sometimes it's there for show, sometimes they're constantly checking documents. One Central Asian country in particular, this was happening all the time, and the police would get very upset if I took a photo. Um but like that's another thing you see that is pretty unpleasant and like kind of really reminds you. And the other thing, and this, like I said, it's different in every place, is, you know, sometimes see a lot of cameras. A lot, like a number of security cameras that makes you go, that is a lot of cameras. That is an excessive number of cameras. And that's another thing I think we're not to nearly the same extent, but we could see here. I feel like, you know, you know, stuff like the Amazon like just walk out store technology is certainly one way that like we might get normalized towards just having a lot of cameras. And then the other side to this though is that all of these measures that you see that are these very visible measures, a lot of people like them because in their mind that's how you keep crime down. And a lot of people don't like disorder. Again, that's another thing we see a lot here too.
So I've had some perhaps more interesting experiences in terms of my visit to Russia. This was back in 2011. Um, Medvedev was president at the time. I guess Putin was at the time
He was on sabbatical.
um, beyond on sabbatical. He was nodding at least to the notion of following a constitution, maybe less in practice than in what he was showing the public, but he was taking a different role in government to follow laws there. Obviously, these laws do not exist anymore. It's just straight up Putin all the time. But there was a protest in Red Square, and the police came down hard. Um, Although once they find out that you have an American passport, they want you out of there quickly, and they don't want, you know, um, a little wild, but they just wanted nothing to do with having us there. They
Yeah,
just wanted like they saw that we weren't protesting. They saw we were watching the protest, and they didn't want us to watch. They didn't want us to get caught up in it. They were trying to explain it from a safety perspective, but I felt quite confident that the protesters were not angry at us. Somewhat like Donald Trump maybe feeling safe on January 6th. You know, you know who they're there for, and you know it's not you. So just sit back and enjoy the show. Um, I would also say on this Russian trip, they took us for the first half of it at least. It felt extremely like we were on tour with a tour guide and there for tourism and not to study. And, you know, trust me, there are some ornate palaces and museums, all kinds of fascinating things to see.
yeah,
But they did, shockingly, towards the end of the trip, they started taking us to much less interesting things as far as they were concerned. but having us meet with artists, Jewish music students, so much more interesting, like going into poorer apartments and seeing the shared kitchen, the individual apartments that were just bedrooms, uh seeing
Yeah.
how ordinary people live, visiting medical facilities. It was an eye-opening experience, to say the least. What was your time in Russia like?
So I was in Russia like quite a bit later. Like I said, it was a bit before COVID. The other big thing I'm gonna put in Russia is that I was totally on the like opposite end. I was in I went to a town called Magadan, which is mostly famous for having it was founded, I believe, in the 20th century, and it was mostly famous for having been the center of a big part of the Gulag system. There's an old and when people would get out, they would live there for a while. So there's always these old Soviet jokes. One of which was that Magadan was the artistic capital of the Soviet Union. That's where all and indeed one of the things I did get to go do is talk to the widow of a local artist. We went to a memorial to the Gulag system, which I feel it's there. Certainly it's out of the way and not a lot of Russians are going to see it, but you can tell like it's there kind of reluctantly now. But it's there. They haven't really, you know, or at least they hadn't prior to 2022 tried to stop it. But like that, that's the first thing. The other thing that was like, interesting is, famously, you're not allowed to have rainbow flags in Russia ever since they passed the whole you can't promote gayness with one exception, which is the provincial flag of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, because that was a rainbow flag too. You can fly that one.
I'm guessing more people fly it than who belong to the Jewish Autonomous Oblast.
No, 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 no. But so with that aside, you're not even supposed to have a rainbow flag. And I can tell you all, nobody was flying a rainbow flag for any reason to declare any gayness. There sure were a lot of people wearing shirts and stuff with rainbow logos for an ostensibly banned thing. And I don't think it was any expression of gayness. I think it was just, you know, there's an old Chinese expression, I think I need to look it up, but it's something like the hand of the law is slow and the emperor is far away.
Of all the places you visited, I know you mentioned Russia as being the one you'd be least interested in
There
returning
we
to.
go. The mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And certainly that felt the case in Magadan, even though, like I said, no one was gonna go out and say they didn't like Putin. No one was, and probably the average person there is okay with Putin. And noticeably when we went to Yakutsk, which is also pretty far east, but a place you might have actually heard of, Yakutsk, much more connected. It's been around longer than St. Petersburg. Like it's an old Russian city, even though it is very 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 far east. That is much more deeply connected into sort of the Russian mainstream. Like it does become, you don't see that as much. Like, the mountains are still high and the emperor is still far away, but he's not quite as far. And that shift is noticeable.
So, of all the places you visited, at least as far as societies that the average American would probably find relatively repressive compared to what they're used to, where would you most want to stay if you had the opportunity?
I mean, what do you mean stay?
Like if you were gonna go live abroad in one
I
of
mean,
the
I've stayed in Cuba for 4 months and I found that, honestly, there it's, it's not a particularly representative government, but also it's not particularly repressive either. Like I talked to people who very openly stated in Spanish, being Cuban citizens, their disagreements with the Communist Party. Really the biggest thing that made staying in Cuba kind of dreary was just the lack of variety of goods because of the embargo, much more so than anything. Um, and essentially some of the fact that the country had to be fairly self-sufficient in certain things, and sometimes stuff fails. Um, in terms of which I would find, the easiest to live in, probably China, just because it feels normal. Lots of people live there.
You're listening to WUSB Stony Brook 90.1 FM. I'm talking to a Stony Brook graduate who has traveled the world and certainly some unusual places. Um, what are what are some things that you would encourage Americans to perhaps learn from these places as government becomes, as you put it earlier, more personalized here?
You know, life goes on. People still enjoy their day to day, and I think you should still enjoy your day to day. Obviously, you know that, just because the government doesn't like you you know, doesn't mean you can't be you, even if unfortunately, like, you know, as- sometimes the lobby says you can't be yourself. And that, is horrible, but also know that like life goes on and you are not your government.
Other than, I guess the big example I've been using is Hungary. I think that's a fairly common one used in the media. Are there any countries where that you visited where you feel might be a good heads up or model as to where we are moving towards?
Hard to say. Some of this is it's early days and we don't know. And, frankly, as is the case in much of history with any society, currently there's a few different competing visions. And the folks at the top are squabbling. I don't think, Elon Musk's vision is Donald Trump's vision, and I don't think that's Russ Vought's vision.
Of the three, which one's scariest to you?
Musk.
Why?
He has the fewest personal guardrails. He is apparently totally willing to go and just, delete things without backup. I think all of these people are willing to cause pain. Trump, at least due to his need to be admired, I feel like that puts a little bit of a strain on him in ways that like he does not want to do things that make him unpopular. That doesn't mean he won't do things that make him unpopular, particularly if, his various advisors handle him well. But to me, the one that scares me the most is Musk because he is just apparently willing to go do things with almost zero regard for how it is perceived. I'm not sure that's going to totally serve him in the long run,
To
but
me, Vought's the scariest specifically because uh, I don't think Musk and Trump have the grand strategic vision. I don't think they have the discipline. And frankly, I think they're both more operating on a more personal level in terms of what they're against. Like, you're against me, so I'm against you. Whereas Vought, I think, really does have erasures of entire sections of society in mind.
he has a vision.
Yeah.
I think Trump has a vision too. What I think he doesn't have is a good blueprint to reach that vision.
Yeah, and with
He wants America to be where it was when he was young. Plus tariffs.
wants America to be where it was when he was young, except I hate to break it to him, when he was young, America was fighting fascists in Europe instead of trying to make alliances with them, instead of trying to convince the normal folks in Europe to be kinder to the fascists. Like, I don't think it's quite as simple as where things were when he was younger. Maybe where things were when he was younger in Madison Square Garden on a particular night. Uh, but it just seems a little different.
Yeah, he has a vision, but he wants that. Plus, he wants tariffs for some. He's got that. Plus, this vision of this very old-fashioned imperialist. I say his most consistent beliefs seem to be country big is good and tariffs.
I actually I find it very interesting that you talk about the embargo in Cuba as being one of the most noticeable downsides to one of these societies.
I mean,
And
some people say, and I think
how
this
could
is a
the tariffs actually be bringing us to a similar
a bit,
place?
yeah. So one thing I will say is that people say, oh, the embargo is used as a shield to hide the Cuban state's inefficiencies. And I do think there's a bit of truth to that. But also, this gets to the more basic level that, like, trade exists in you know, trade can exist, either as a primary system of way of getting things or as a sort of a backfill. And in Cuba, because of the embargo, when they cannot produce enough coffee or, you know, because that, or eggs, there's just no eggs, no coffee you know, right now, coincidentally, there's actually a bit of a glut in egg supplies in China. Uh, interestingly,
Using your connections over there, do you think you could get us more eggs?
no, because well, Frank, if you really think about it, what you would actually be replacing is the packaged egg products. So like like your liquid eggs,
Hmm.
you could use that to backfill. You could use foreign imported eggs, but you couldn't really import fresh eggs, partly because fresh egg processing is very different in the rest of the world than it is in the US and blah blah blah. But that said, I have heard there's apparently increasing cases of border patrol, not border patrol, sorry, CBP, busting people at the Mexican border with eggs
That's pretty funny.
because they're not having the same level of problem in Mexico.
With these other states you go to, you mentioned the bureaucracy there.
But sorry, can I get back to the embargo for a sec? But
Yeah.
so the thing is though that like while Cuba does, import a fair bit of stuff, it's not a very wealthy country because of the embargo with what would be their most obvious large trading partner, and they do have to make a lot of their own stuff domestically, and sometimes that fails. And that's something that, you know, similarly, North Korea, they're very big on their whole like we are self-sufficient thing, like that's kind of their central philosophy. And, you know, And that's something to think about when it comes to tariffs, specifically in Trump's view of we want to Trump's weird view that we want to simultaneously be old-fashioned imperialist by expanding our borders with this totally bonkers idea to absorb a large country because hey, country is big, big country is good. Why do you think he likes Russia so much? Uh, big country.
I think it's more he wants Putin's position.
But still, it's like, I do think at a very basic level, Trump looks at big countries and thinks this is good. When Trump was young, the British Empire still existed, the French Empire still existed. Um, but yeah, it's that view on the one hand, and the somewhat contradictory view of we must shut ourselves off from the world and make everything ourselves. But sometimes our own supply chains are going to fail. And unlike was the case with COVID, they're not usually failing with all of the rest of the world at the same time.
You plan on continuing to travel to weird places?
Yep. I've slowed down a bit post-COVID, but I would like to do some traveling, Afghanistan at this point is safer for foreign tourists than it has been at any point in my lifetime, and so that's a place I'm very curious about.
Afghanistan.
It's gotten to the point where I'm even seeing, and this is real, like Afghanistan. And I know algorithmic feeds are bad, but it's very interesting when I look at like my algorithmic YouTube short feeds, and I'm starting to see like travel content for Afghanistan. Like these are the 10 things you can't miss in Kabul, or don't fall for this scam in Kandahar, and that's actual content that's being produced now. Imagine telling that someone that in 2018.
So you'd consider entering the country, presumably being escorted around by the Taliban.
I mean, they allow you to visit the whole thing is they were, it's the safest it's been for foreign tourists in my entire lifetime.
Here's a question that I think
Because who were making it really unsafe before? Who were doing the majority of the attacking tourists?
the
The
Taliban,
Taliban. Who is now in charge of making sure that doesn't happen and have kind of a different incentive? The
that's
Taliban.
the Taliban's
You know,
right back.
that's what happens when you get into government. There was a whole piece I got a few years ago when the Taliban took over that was like talking to disaffected Taliban people who were so upset they had to have desk jobs now. Yeah, that's what happens when you win.
That is funny. Um, do you are you able to resist sort of this how do I put it into words? This ick factor. Like I am someone who struggles to get along with people who show no respect for the rule of law. So, is there like any difficulty for you to be spending extended periods of time with tour guides who are in some way complicit in human rights abuses?
I mean, most of these people are for the most part, so for the most part, they're citizens. This is when you're with a tour. Um, which sometimes you aren't. You don't really need to do this in Cuba. Theoretically, if you have a non-US, UK, Canadian passport, you can get away with a lot more in Iran. Um, you know, and there's a lot of places you don't really need a tour guide in Russia. Like you can I did go through an organized trip through Russia, but that was largely because I was a big part of the trip was going on a highway that is extremely isolated. And so I wanted to be with a group with people who would be able to give me medical attention. So, but I do want to give that aside that oftentimes you don't need that. Sometimes you do by law, like if you're visiting Iran, um, is a notable one. And the thing I'll put to that is like usually these guys they're not reps of the government. They're ordinary citizens who are just doing a job that they can get into because they speak foreign languages. That's really what it is. You know. Uh I will say it varies, a bit from place to place, but like especially in Iran, your average tour guide is not someone who's coming like they're coming from a privileged enough background that they were able to learn a foreign language, but they're not coming from the elite. Like
I mean,
fundamentally, a tour guide in Iran isn't very different from a tour guide in Peru.
yeah, I just take all these things into consideration. Like, okay, if I'm going to go on vacation, am I traveling in areas that are totally opposed to my points of view, and is my money being funneled into the sorts of things that would
That's a different question. That's not about tour guides. Like I
okay.
said, most of the people. that you are, like I said, most of the people that you're interacting with, I really do mean when I say like a tour guide in Iran is not that different from a tour guide in Peru. It's just it's some guy who's doing a job that oftentimes has a tip part to it, so it's pretty attractive because the tips are in foreign country currency. But
Mm.
they're not there to sell you on their viewpoint. And this by the way is even true in places where there is a more direct government involvement. Like the tour guides are not there to convince you of their viewpoint. They're they might tell you that they'll say this is our history, this is our belief, but they're not there to make you into a believer. Um, now that is now the other side of this is the money side. Yes, but to me, you know, obviously, like in the case of Iran, when you pay the visa fee, that's going directly to the Iranian government,
Mm.
right? Like that's an example. Obviously, you're also going there and you're ultimately paying taxes because like there might be a tax on a restaurant meal. That's obviously going to the government. Um, you know, first of all, do I agree with a lot of these regimes? No. But first of all, frankly, they're using a lot of their tax revenue and stuff for normal government functions. Like, at the end of the day, Iran has a healthcare system that they need to fund somehow with taxes. They're funding,
Wait. They're going to use their taxes for normal government functions. Why can't we get that back?
and the other side of that is that, like, frankly, at that point, like, and I know people, maybe this is a slippery slope thing, but like I I don't experience any moral ick about going to Idaho, even though a place I've been a few times, even though frankly there are people in that government who would like to murder me, like truly, and I am not exaggerating.
Oh no, I do not think for a minute you're exaggerating.
Yes, let me be clear. There are people in the and I don't really have an ick factor about going there, you know.
Good
And
for you,
I'm not
man.
sure that that should change just because it's a foreign geopolitical actor.
Yeah, no, I certainly even when it comes to restaurants on Long Island, like you
In a
know,
sense, I almost feel different about doing stuff like local restaurants because like it starts to feel different when once you're dealing with a beef that's kind of personal. And local, the most recent example was like local restaurant starts testifying at restaurant down the street starts testifying at City Hall for legislation you don't like is a whole other level of like personal than state legislator in Idaho wants to kill you or wants to kill people like you but knows nothing about you personally specifically. And I don't know, maybe that's weird, but
no, I'm just plucking at threads,
yeah. No, I know that's maybe a bit weird, but it's like on that level, that's only, that's something where I almost feel like I do have an impact.
It's 10 a.m. or just about, and you're listening to WUSB Stony Brook 90.1 FM. I'm here with a former Stony Brook student who has gone on to travel some of the more interesting countries in the world, and in order to continue doing so, he's remaining anonymous.
Well, um, it is there is a time zone difference.
Yes.
So I'm I'm currently hitting 1:14 a.m. having this conversation. So is there let me give you your totally anonymous broadcast to all of Long Island moment to speak. Is there anything you really want to say right now?
Uh, yes, actually, there is something I actually really want to say, which is maybe on a slightly different thread.
Okay, I'm here
Go to
for
Mexico. I mean, I've never been to Mexico. I'm actually going there in April for the first time, but go to Mexico. Right now, I cannot think of a country that is being portrayed more negatively in our media and by our government than Mexico. Go there and realize that it's normal.
Or at least the vast majority of areas are
Yes.
normal
No,
and
but also
safe.
that you go there and it is not some weird war zone as the media would have you go. You go there and people are going to restaurants, you know. There's a hip tiki bar in Mexico City I'm gonna go check out. Like, you know, there's museums. It's an ordinary society just like us. So yes, that is actually my current exhortation because right now I feel like that the Mexico is really getting hit badly in the press. It's been hit badly in the press for the last decade, and it's getting it much worse now that our president is apparently determined to make us hate them and them hate us.
Yeah, interesting thoughts on Mexico. Even though it's coming from more of a left-wing angle, I'm still a little discouraged by some of the rule of law erosion. Uh, but
Yes.
it doesn't seem like it's any worse there than it is here.
But but also my main point is like don't paint people who are members of society with the big brush of their government.
Yeah, I think
And this applies to the left, right, and center. Like, you know, like I said, like I don't like the way a lot of mainstream liberals talk about Russians. It's not great the way a lot of left-wingers talk about Israelis. And the way a lot of right-wingers talk about Mexicans is also unacceptable. Like all of these, you can oppose the actions of their governments while realizing that these are societies composed of people who both have lives that are not the actions of their governments and might in fact have a wide variety of perspectives.
yeah, good luck on your continued travels, sir. Well, I hope your continued safety and that you have opportunities to see many more interesting ways of life and places and all that.